If you've ever walked through a neighborhood and thought, why does this place just work? This episode is definitely for you. And if you've ever experienced the complete opposite, a place that feels disconnected, stressful, expensive, or built without people in mind, this episode is also for you too. Because better cities don't happen by accident. They are designed, measured, and improved over time. Most people know LEED as the gold standard for green buildings, but buildings are only one piece of the puzzle. Great cities also depend on transportation, housing, public space, resilience, and whether opportunity is accessible to the people who live there. So what happens when you take the logic of LEED and apply it to an entire community? Well, today's guest is Dr. Vatsal Bhatt, Vice President for LEED for Communities at the U.S. Green Building Council. With 20 years of experience as an energy economist, he has worked at the U.S. Department of Energy's Brookhaven National Lab, providing technical assistance to national and local governments on low-carbon urban growth strategies. In this conversation, we explore why LEED for Cities and Communities was launched, how it differs from earlier frameworks, and whether rating systems simply validate good projects or can actually change how communities are planned and built. I'm Kate Gasparo, and this is Building Better Cities. So listeners are probably familiar with LEED for buildings, and LEED is the most famous or preeminent rating system for green buildings. Green as in social and environmental sustainability in the built environment. So if we were to rewind back to 2016 when LEED for Communities and Cities was launched,
Right.
what problem was that trying to solve that might have been different from LEED for neighborhoods? And can you talk more specifically about that transition? It seemed that data was a focal point of that conversation, but were there other dynamics at play for the emergence of LEED for Communities and Cities?
I'll step back and explain this a little bit more in detail. With LEED for cities and communities, LEED goes beyond buildings to an urban scale for measuring and improving sustainability. From the interiors of the buildings to communities and cities, LEED is trying to connect priorities for carbon neutrality and well-being. So in concept, LEED for cities and communities is trying to comprehensively transform ecosystem and services, resilience, transportation, land use, water, energy, climate change, waste materials, social equity, affordability, economic development, public health, and of course, safety at an urban scale. And currently, I just wanted to put it in context that more than 550 cities and communities are using this framework. So to your question about when we launched this particular rating system, LEED for cities and LEED for communities in December 2016, I think what we learned from the way LEED for buildings was operating and LEED for neighborhood developments was also operating, we said, let us try to make this rating system more outcomes oriented, more quantifiable. And, in a way, we keep these systems quite agile. So even though we launched these rating systems in December 2016, we launched version 4.1 in April 2019. Learning from how it gets deployed in the market, we created a very large addenda for LEED for cities existing in 2023. And in February 2024, we came out with another big addenda for LEED for communities in plan and design. These are processes that we follow at USGBC. So in a nutshell, we are trying to keep these rating systems more agile, continuously improving, but simple. These improvements are mainly based on what we heard from our stakeholders, on how we can help them in transforming their cities and communities to improve quality of life of all people.
That's very interesting, especially because, this podcast is called Building Better Cities, and that means so many different things to so many people. And building better cities for whom is often the question that I get. And that's the question that you're probably responding to as you're getting stakeholder feedback on how this rating system needs to evolve. So if we go back to the fundamental principles, you listed off quite a few that LEED for cities and communities is trying to attain. So better services, better resilience, transportation, land use, water, energy,
Hmm.
climate change, and the list goes on and on. At its fundamental principles, can you list some that are core to what Lead for Cities and Communities is that haven't changed, even though there have been addenda to these rating systems?
This is at the core of what we all working with urban systems do. What we did was step back from this discussion and said, okay, what all we need, what cities need, what
Mm-hmm.
communities need, what people using these cities and communities need. That was our fundamental thought process. And so the core principles that we tried to address with these rating systems was mostly outcome oriented solutions, but in terms of comprehensive planning, design, development, management, and improvement of these cities and communities. Trying to talk about net zero priorities for energy, emissions, water, waste, materials. Talking about social equity, environmental justice, human rights, affordability, public health, safety, well being at a scale of large scale developments. Resource conservation, ecosystem restoration, as well as resilience at again this large urban scale. Smart growth principles are baked into what LEED does. So, like 15-minute community priorities, 15-minute city priorities like compact mixed use development, walkability, bikeability, intermodal connectivity, nearness to public transit. But we are also very intrinsically talking about economic development, strategic upskilling for people. At the same time, data driven discussions, smart city solutions are also key part of these core principles that we were looking into building in not only in one requirement or one category, but across categories and interconnecting these priorities at an urban scale.
There's a lot of competing interests here when you start talking about environmental sustainability, social equity, 15-minute cities, and then you bake in the layer that the scale you're talking about, there's a lot of institutional structures and barriers to achieving these goals. And I'm curious, you work with communities and cities all over the world that have very different constraints. How do they think about grappling with the complexity of a rating system that's trying to solve for a lot of things at the same time?
Let me decode this thought process and fundamental question that you asked, trying to simplify, but still trying to decode this effectiveness. I think what we tried is to craft a rating system that is very intuitive and simple. That is the kind of thought process. And we all understand data, but when it becomes too much, it becomes a jumble of things. Go step by step. When we started working on developing this rating system framework, whatever we call it, almost 12 years ago, we stepped back and said, what do cities need? What do communities need? What do people need? At a higher level, what are the different subsystems of this rating system? And then we also looked into the existing status, current status of cities and communities. What would be the ideal state of
Mm.
all these urban systems or cities and communities? And how people perceive it, feel it, touch it, experience it. So that was our prima facie thought process. Then we started looking into how we can measure and quantify outcomes on environment, economic development, social equity at the community scale, city scale. And if we can measure these things, then people who are working with cities and communities can get together on a table and strategize on how systematically they can improve it over time.
Mm.
In this particular process, while we were developing the rating system, we included city officials, urban developers, urban planners, experts who are working with these systems and cities and communities day in and out. They understand what works and what doesn't work.
Mm-hmm.
And they helped us in balancing this framework between so many different priorities that we had. It kept telling us, make it simple, make it simple, make it simple. In this discussion, we realized that every community is different in terms of size, scale, location, climate, economic condition, and other priorities. But that is why our rating systems focus on quantifiable outcomes, outcomes,
Mm.
outcomes, outcomes, and quantifiable.
Mm-hmm.
Creates a seamless connection between globally diverse communities. They are giving them a common level playing field. And this is powerful concept, creating a comprehensive and creative ecosystem of all these communities working with us. Emphasize this, that these rating systems do not try to guide the process, but rather focus on outcomes for people. That is leaving ample opportunity for innovation for each of these communities working with us.
I like how you're focusing on the end and letting communities justify what the means are to get to the same end that is quantifiable. And it reflects how LEED for buildings has changed over the years. It used to be pretty prescriptive, and now it's becoming closer to this outcome oriented approach that you're speaking to. And for those that are more familiar with LEED for buildings, can we go back to the premise of cities and communities? And how are cities and communities different from a building? And how are cities and communities different from each other? Because these are all different scales in the built environment.
We have learned so much from all these 30 years of harvested knowledge about improving LEED over time. And so many of my colleagues who were that time working on LEED kept on telling us that the rating system first was in this state and then that state, and then we kept on improving. So I think those learnings really helped us in leapfrogging that entire process. That is how we could come up with these discussions and outcome oriented priorities. Communities and cities are nothing much but amalgamation or aggregation of a lot of buildings, and then of course a lot of systems that are interconnecting those buildings and people and all. But we all know cities and communities have so many different priorities because they govern different things, or they work on different things, they guide different things. So even when we launched this particular rating system, it was earlier in the pilot version only data oriented discussion. But then our stakeholders said, but we still need some prescription, some guidance. So in version 4.1, we aligned it with version 4.1 for buildings. Just to name a person, my colleague Melissa Baker said, use this version 4.1 for BDC and see how we can utilize that structure or thought process to create a rating system 4.1 for cities and communities. When we launched version 4.1 in April 2019, we launched only 2 rating systems. LEED for cities and communities in plan and design phase, and LEED for cities and communities existing. Only 2 rating systems. However, over the last 6-7 years, we learned that each of those elements need its own small rating system. So now we have 4 different elements of this rating systems of cities and communities. So we have LEED for cities existing that are working with all existing cities, like in which we all live, whether they are large cities, small cities, towns, counties, or other local government jurisdictions. Cities in planning and designing phase that works with large city scale projects that are newly developing. We have a lot of projects in Asia, Middle East, Latin America using this particular rating system. But our most used rating system is for communities that are newly developing or redeveloping. We call it LEED for Communities Plan and Design. So many communities in the United States, Europe, Latin America, Asia, and the Middle East certify to this particular rating system when they are in planning and designing phase of communities, whether large scale community or small scale community and everything in between. And our rating systems offer solutions for urban developments in all phases. So we want decision makers to use our framework to plan and design a community with net zero, smart growth principles, social equity principles. But we also believe in communities being managed and operated at those high standards as well. So this version, called LEED for Existing Communities, offers data, measurement, as well as reporting, so that decision makers can utilize them to improve their communities and offering their people the best quality of life. So I just separated out these 4 different parts of LEED for cities and communities rating systems.
That's very helpful. And I think when people can wrap their heads around LEED for buildings. Usually that is a single developer or it's an architect reaching out to USGPC to fulfill the requirements for that rating system. Who do you work with at a community level or a city level? Who is your point of contact when they're reaching out to you to say, is this possible for my community or city?
Absolutely. I'll try to now focus a little bit more on lead for communities. These communities are of different scales. Some projects are like 10, 30, 50 acres. Others are 100, 150, 200 acres. And few that we work with are really large. They're like 10,000, 20,000, 30,000 acres projects.
Wow.
So the scale and size differs quite a lot. And each of these project is very unique in its purpose, size, climate. But globally, our projects utilize our rating system since it applies seamlessly to each of these local conditions because of that discussion that we just had about outcomes. And who use it? Technically, anyone can certify a community. But so far, our main stakeholders are real estate developers, corporates, urban planners, urban designers, sustainability consultants, lead consultants, government agencies, universities, non-governmental organizations, not-for-profit organizations.
That's a wide range of stakeholders. And to make this more tangible to our listeners, since you work with over 300 communities globally, can you share a few examples of the specific stakeholders and the specific projects that are using the LEED for Communities framework?
Sure. I'll try to now change the angle a little bit and talk about typology as well. For an example, we have mixed use developments like the Heights in St. Paul, Minnesota, or on Main in Dayton, Ohio, or Mind in Italy, that is Milan Innovation District in Milan, Italy. These are just examples which are prioritizing social equity along with carbon neutrality. We have some other developer-led projects like Boston Properties, big developer, Howard Hughes Corporation, big developer in the South, Landlease, global developer as well, Constructora Bolivar in Colombia, or Wanka in China, or DLF in India, and many other developers that are utilizing this particular rating system for achieving high levels of sustainability and social equity. We have corporate campuses like Siemensstadt Square in Berlin, Germany, or Samsung's project in Shenzhen, China. We have some airport projects. Now, airports are the bastions of new technologies being deployed in cities. And because that's where so many people come in and go out of, and they can observe these technologies and talk about their good projects. So like airports in San Francisco, California, or Atlanta, Georgia, or a couple of other projects, say in Mexico and so on and so forth, they are trying to utilize this rating system to talk about their carbon neutrality, zero water, zero waste kind of priorities as well. And then some economic zones that are working with us. For an example, Beijing Daxing International Airport Economic Zone, which is around 50 square kilometer area around Beijing's third international airport, or King Salman Energy Park in Saudi Arabia. Say, for an example, New Clark City in Philippines, which is like roughly 95 square kilometer area. These are all leading their way in terms of resilience, mobility, green spaces, and sustainability for large like port-based developments. So port-based developments, economic development corporations can use it. There are some financial hubs like Porta Nova in Milan or Westbund in Shanghai, or some kind of purpose-oriented like Winter Olympics projects like in Lake Placid in New York, or Zicheng in Hebei, where they had one of the villages, one of the three villages for China's Beijing's Winter Olympic. Then we have redeveloping projects like Madrid Nova Norte in Madrid in Spain, or Nansha Hengli Island in Guangzhou, China, or many other projects in mostly Europe and USA as well. Then we have a lot of master planned communities or planned urban developments or planned unit developments as well, like Howard Hughes Corporation's large communities near Houston named Woodlands and Bridgeland, or Colony Park in Austin. So these are different kinds of projects that we can talk about.
You said you're working in almost every continent around the globe when it comes to these projects. And The rating system and the outcomes stay the same regardless of the culture context that you're working in. And I'm so curious, what are the different perspectives you hear when people come to the LEED system? Are they saying, yes, this is super aligned with what my government wants to do, or no, I kind of have to push a little harder on energy, but we're on the same page when it comes to social equity? Can you sort of talk through the challenges that each of these specific locales lend themselves to when they're pursuing LEED?
Challenges or opportunities, right? We can take it from both ways. For an example, they can tackle various aspects of it. Many projects use this rating system in different ways. Let's begin with governance. LEED is known for developing cohesive and interconnected governance. Similarly, LEED for communities breaks silos between various project teams and departments, brings them on the same table, brings all stakeholders on that table as well. So different like project teams as well as other stakeholders. Additionally, this particular framework offers seamless governance structure for planning, developing, operating, and improving communities with data-driven decision making for all systems considered. Some communities are using this as a holistic framework for planning and development. Like Castra Bolivar is one of the big developers in Colombia. They are using this rating system since 2019. They are using it for their 14 large scale developments. Each development is like for 10,000 people, 20,000 people, and so on and so forth. Many of these communities also use LEED for communities to synergize with ESG goals, environmental social governance goals, or sustainable development goals, or net zero priorities, whether it's net zero for energy, carbon, water, waste. And there are so many examples, but just two. One is Blackstone Properties, and second is Red Sea Global in Saudi Arabia. Some of the communities use this to attract financial investment as well as investments in human capital. The Heights in St. Paul is a mixed use 112 acres development on a previously brownfield site. They are trying to go net zero, and in that effort, achieved Minnesota Green Bank's first ever financing for a geothermal system. Some use it to validate and communicate sustainability leadership. Like, for an example, one of the largest sovereign wealth funds in the world, the Public Investment Fund of Saudi Arabia, is using LEED for communities for all of its projects. Some others are using it to set global and local benchmarks and best practices. Like 3 banks in Colombia use it: Bank of Colombia, Davivienda, and Banco Bogota. This rating system to identify and achieve their goals and targets, SDG, ESG, and other priorities that they may have. And some are using to track progress and measure performance. This is one of the key elements for which projects use this rating system. For example, one of our projects, Siemensstadt Square in Berlin, the 70 hectares area around Siemens' first factory building, is getting redeveloped as the most advanced technology innovation and mixed-use hub. They are going carbon neutral and using smart city and AI technologies along with digital twinning for measuring and improving performance. Similar is the case for Madrid Nuevo Norte in Spain, which is a 235 hectares redevelopment in north of Madrid around the Chamartin station, railway station. So these are some examples on how they use it.
The context is so different for each of these, and you're saying the goals for them is also just as different. And when you think about any rating system, there's this big critique that is the rating system there to validate actions that would have been there regardless? Or is the rating system actually shifting and changing behavior around how people develop the built environment? What have you seen in practice across this very vast portfolio of projects?
It is about changing behavior in one community at a time. We strongly believe that the transformation will amplify over time to improve conditions in all of our communities around the globe.
Mm-hmm.
LEED started and led the green building movement more than 30 years ago. See where we are today. We all are designing, developing, operating LEED buildings, net zero buildings, and so on and so forth. And we want to bring a similar transformation for regenerative, healthy, equitable communities and cities globally with LEED for communities as well.
So If a community is first being introduced to this approach, this outcome driven approach, what is the type of data infrastructure they need to set up at the beginning of a project? And is that a cost burden or process burden to them as they're going through this already large undertaking of redeveloping, planning for a community?
This is fundamental to the whole discussion. Thank you for asking this question. We can consider this as a hurdle, or we can flip it and say it's easy because we want to meet each unique project where they are in their journey. We don't want to really change discussion for anybody. I mentioned technologically advanced projects like Siemensstadt Square in Berlin, but many other projects are just starting in this process. So we want to work with them right from the planning and designing process. Our requirements focus on outcomes based data metrics. If project teams do not have actual data, they start by putting together credible and verifiable estimate. Then they put guidelines and frameworks for systematically collecting data as the project becomes operational, and then use LEED for existing communities rating system to measure progress and improve over time.
How are city builders thinking differently and community builders thinking differently about the outcomes they want to see in the places they're building? And now we just sort of talked about the method in which they need to achieve that in a data driven, strategic way. And that might resonate in some cultures and some places around the world and not in others. I want your anecdotal thoughts on this is where does lead the outcomes and the data driven method resonate the most? And where is it sort of evolving differently or asking you to think differently about deploying lead?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we want to meet with each and every community in their journey wherever they are, right? So that is our larger thought process. But so far, out of those 300 community projects that we have been working with, we have more than 80 community projects in Asia, 60 in Latin America, 40 in the Middle East, and 120 in US and Europe. I'm just mentioning very high level numbers. In this particular discussion, Lead for Communities offers credibility and standardization in evaluating and certifying sustainability, resilience, and social equity in urban developments, community level urban developments. It is about the readiness of each community. Wherever they are, we want to meet them in that process. And we are very mindful of each individual stakeholder as they see the value in adapting our holistic solution covering all aspects within a community, affecting all people, they will adopt it. So we are trying to be very mindful of our stakeholders and we want to meet them where they are. Very simple.
Mm.
Data in today's world, we talk about artificial intelligence and a lot of data related discussion. So I think talking about holistic solutions with data at the heart, at the core of the process is going to resonate with different people. It depends. The time is right for whom, when, where, and how. And I think we are ready to meet with them wherever they are.
I'm always curious that the individuals that come to you that just start registering a project, you said that you're meeting them where they're at, and that could be zero understanding or even belief that a sustainable project is a better project. And same with our listeners. There are people who come here for many different reasons, and they might think that lead is hokey pokey. And then there are those who are totally bought in and think that this is the best rating system out there. It's so comprehensive. I believe in every pillar and principle of this rating system. I'm curious if in that spectrum, there is some sort of similarity with everyone who's coming to you in the way that they are approaching their own development, regardless of their belief in a sustainable community is the best community.
When I was at Keywood National Laboratory working with US Department of Energy projects, my senior colleague Mark Ginsberg was leading those projects. And that time, US Department of Energy was focusing on net zero buildings. And we thought, let's take this concept to cities and communities. I was working on behalf of US Department of Energy with India and China, with cities, working with the national government agencies and so on and so forth. We said, let's try to talk about net zero cities, meaning net zero energy cities. All the decision makers, policy makers in these governments, in cities, they said, we appreciate your optimism, but we are worried about next 24 hours. Forget about net zero or 2050. So bringing that discussion back, we said, let's start talking about cities going towards net zero because they are in transition. Same discussion here. Wherever our projects are, wherever our stakeholders are, we want to meet them where they are because they are in the transition. And I think using this framework to really comprehensively urban challenges and priorities is a good way of doing it. Each project may not be able to go net zero today, but they are in that transition process. And it's not about net zero only on energy, water, waste, materials, but even talking about social equity, right? Which is so central to what we all do every day. We are looking for equity in our own context, our own environment. But here we are talking about equity, social equity priorities for everybody using, working, living, playing within these communities. So I think that is our priority to really build that aspect of it. Some people call it regenerative communities, whatever those names are. I think it's about improving one community at a time, one step at a time. I think that can be very unique for all of us to move toward that higher objective. And we all do that for our own health, for our own family. So I think taking the same concept together at a community scale can be useful for all of us to achieve that larger mark so that we live our planet for future generations as well.
What I appreciated most in this discussion is the reminder that progress doesn't have to start with perfection. Cities and communities don't need every answer on day one. They need a framework, a willingness to measure what matters, and the discipline to improve over time. I know there are others in your life who would appreciate this episode too, people actively working to build better cities. So don't hesitate to share with them, and come check out our work at buildingbettercities.com. Until next time, let's keep building better cities together.